The story of Jim Morrison has long been surrounded by mystery, fascination, and unanswered questions, and even decades after his sudden death, the world remains captivated by the possibility that the full truth of what happened in the summer of 1971 may still be hidden somewhere between legend and reality. Morrison was not just another rock singer, but a cultural force whose poetic lyrics, rebellious spirit, and hypnotic stage presence helped transform the band The Doors into one of the most influential groups of the 1960s, creating songs that blended psychedelic rock, blues, and dark philosophical themes into a sound that captured the restless energy of an entire generation. From the haunting rhythm of Riders on the Storm to the hypnotic atmosphere of Light My Fire, Morrison's voice carried a unique intensity that seemed to blur the boundary between poetry and music, turning live performances into unpredictable spectacles that could swing from quiet introspection to explosive chaos in a matter of moments. Yet behind the charisma and artistic brilliance, there was always a darker side to Morrison's life, one shaped by heavy drinking, personal turmoil, and the pressures that came with becoming an icon of the counterculture movement almost overnight. By the early 1970s, a constant spotlight and the controversies surrounding his behavior had begun to weigh heavily on him, particularly after his legal troubles in the United States following a controversial concert in Miami in 1969, an incident that resulted in a highly publicized trial and conviction that left Morrison feeling increasingly disillusioned with fame. Seeking escape from the chaos surrounding him, Morrison decided to leave the United States and travel to Paris with his longtime partner Pamela Courson, hoping that distance from the music industry might allow him to focus on writing poetry and rediscover a sense of peace away from the relentless attention of fans and the press. For a time, Paris seemed to offer exactly what he had been searching for, a slower rhythm of life where he could wander through historic streets, spend hours in cafes discussing literature, and reconnect with the creative passions that had originally inspired him before rock stardom consumed his identity. Yet the tranquility of that new chapter would prove tragically short-lived, because on July 3, 1971, Morrison was found dead in the bathtub of the apartment he shared with Courson, an event that instantly sent shockwaves through the music world and ignited one of the most enduring mysteries in rock history. The official cause of death was recorded as heart failure, but what made the situation unusual, and what has fueled speculation ever since, was the fact that no autopsy was performed, leaving crucial questions unanswered and creating a vacuum in which rumors and theories could flourish. In the absence of clear medical evidence, countless stories began circulating about what might have really happened that night in Paris, ranging from accidental overdose to secret cover-ups and even the persistent myth that Morrison might not have died at all but instead staged his disappearance to escape the pressures of fame. While many historians and investigators believe the most likely explanation involves complications related to drug use, the lack of definitive proof has allowed the mystery to endure for more than half a century, transforming Morrison's passing into one of the most debated events in rock history. The secrecy surrounding the circumstances of his death was intensified by the relatively small funeral that followed, as Morrison was quietly buried in Palace Cemetery, a place already famous as a resting place of artists, writers, and cultural icons. Yet few could have predicted that Morrison's grave would eventually become one of the most visited sites in the cemetery, attracting fans from around the world who come to pay tribute to the man whose music helped define an era. Over the years, the legend of Jim Morrison has only grown stronger, fueled not only by the haunting beauty of his songs, but also by the unresolved questions surrounding his final moments, questions that continue to inspire documentaries, books, and endless debates among fans and historians alike. The idea that new details might one day emerge, revealing the truth about what happened during those final hours in Paris, remains a powerful source of fascination, because Morrison's life and death seemed to embody the very spirit of the counterculture movement he helped shape, brilliant, rebellious, mysterious, and forever unfinished. Even today, more than 50 years later, the story of Jim Morrison stands as a reminder how quickly fame can collide with personal struggle, leaving behind a legacy that feels both larger than life and tragically incomplete. And perhaps that is why the mystery surrounding his passing continues to captivate the world, because in many ways it reflects the same enigmatic quality that defined Morrison himself, a poet of rock and roll whose final chapter still feels like a puzzle waiting to be solved today as the years passed after the sudden death of Jim Morrison. The mystery surrounding his final hours in Paris only seemed to deepen, transforming what might have been a tragic but straightforward death into one of the most debated and emotionally charged questions in the history of rock music. Morrison had always lived a life that balanced artistic brilliance with reckless success. and during his time with the Doors, he became one of the most recognizable and controversial figures of the 1960s counterculture, captivating audiences with songs that felt more like dark poetry than traditional rock lyrics, including unforgettable tracks such as Light My Fire and the haunting final recording Riders on the Storm. Yet by the beginning of the 1970s, the pressure of fame had begun to weigh heavily on him, particularly after the scandal that erupted following a chaotic concert in Miami in 1969, when Morrison was accused of indecent behavior on stage, leading to a highly publicized trial that left him feeling increasingly alienated from the music industry and the media that constantly scrutinized his life. Seeking distance from the controversies and hoping to rediscover his identity beyond the role of rock star, Morrison left the United States and moved to Paris with his longtime companion Pamela Courson, imagining a quieter life, where he could focus on writing poetry and exploring the city's rich artistic history. During those months in Paris, he was often seen wandering the streets, visiting bookstores and cafes, and spending long hours discussing literature, philosophy, and art, seemingly trying to reconnect with the intellectual curiosity that had always been at the heart of his personality. However, despite this attempt to escape the chaos of fame, Morrison's struggles with alcohol and drugs reportedly continued, and those close to him later suggested that his health had become increasingly fragile during his final weeks. On the morning of July 3, 1971, Pamela Courson discovered Morrison lifeless in the bathtub of their apartment, a moment that would instantly send shockwaves through the music world and ignite speculation that continues even today. French authorities quickly ruled the death as heart failure, but the unusual decision not to conduct an autopsy created a gap in the official record that allowed rumors and alternative theories to flourish, leaving fans and investigators wondering whether the full story had ever truly been revealed. Some theories suggested that Morrison may have suffered an accidental drug overdose, while others proposed far more dramatic possibilities, including claims that he had died elsewhere and been secretly moved to the apartment, or even the persistent legend that he had faked his death entirely in order to escape the overwhelming pressures of fame. While most historians and biographers view these theories with skepticism, the lack of definitive medical evidence means that certain details about Morrison's final hours remain impossible to confirm with absolute certainty, ensuring that the mystery continues to fascinate new generations of fans. The quiet burial that followed only added to the enigmatic atmosphere surrounding his passing, as Morrison was laid to rest in Père Cemetery, a place already associated with legendary artists and writers, yet his grave quickly became something more than a simple resting place. It turned into a pilgrimage site for admirers who felt that Morrison represented a unique voice of rebellion, creativity, and raw emotion that could never truly be replaced. Over the decades, countless visitors have left flowers, poems, graffiti, and messages of admiration at his gravesite, treating it almost like a shrine dedicated to the spirit of an era when music, art, and social change seemed inseparable. Meanwhile, the legend of Jim Morrison continued growing, fueled by documentaries, biographies, and films that attempted to capture the complexity of a man who had once described himself not merely as a singer but as a poet exploring the darker corners of the human experience. What makes the story so haunting is that Morrison died at the age of only 27, joining the tragic group of musicians often referred to as the 27 Club, a list of artists whose extraordinary talent was cut short far too early, leaving the world to wonder what might have been if they had lived longer. Yet even among those legends, Morrison remains uniquely mysterious because the circumstances surrounding his death still feel incomplete, as though an essential piece of the story has been lost somewhere in the passage of time. Perhaps that uncertainty is what continues to draw people toward his music and his memory, because the unresolved questions mirror the enigmatic personality he displayed throughout his life, a performer who seemed to exist somewhere between poet and rock star, between reality and myth, leaving behind a legacy that remains as captivating and unsettling today as it was on the day the world first learned of his mysterious passing to eye in the decades following the shocking death of Jim Morrison. The mystery surrounding that quiet Paris apartment has continued to haunt historians, journalists, and devoted fans who still search for answers to a question that has never been fully resolved. Morrison had already become one of the most enigmatic figures in rock history during his time with the Doors, a group whose dark and poetic sound helped shape the cultural landscape of the late 1960s, turning Morrison into a symbol of rebellion and artistic freedom. Yet unlike many rock stars who embrace the spotlight, Morrison often appeared uncomfortable with fame. describing himself as a writer and poet trapped inside the role of a celebrity musician, and this tension between his artistic identity and his public image followed him throughout his career. By the time the band released the haunting track Riders on the Storm, Morrison had already begun pulling away from the chaotic lifestyle that had defined his earlier years, increasingly expressing a desire to focus on poetry rather than music, a dream that ultimately led him to leave the United States and settle in Paris with his partner Pamela Courson. Paris, with its long history of artists and writers seeking inspiration in its cafes and narrow streets, seemed like the perfect refuge for a man trying to escape the relentless pressure of the American music industry. Friends later recalled that Morrison appeared calmer during his time there, spending long hours reading, writing, and walking through historic neighborhoods. Yet there were also signs of the struggles he had faced for years, particularly his battles with alcohol and drugs, had not completely disappeared. The night before his death remains one of the most mysterious chapters of the story, because very little verified information exists about what actually happened inside the apartment. During those final hours, according to the official account, Morrison was discovered unresponsive in the bathtub by Courson on July 3, 1971, and French authorities quickly ruled the cause of death as heart failure. However, the unusual absence of an autopsy immediately raised questions among those who knew Morrison's turbulent lifestyle, leaving many to wonder whether the official explanation told the entire story. Over the years, numerous theories have emerged, some suggesting that Morrison may have suffered an accidental overdose that was quietly handled by authorities to avoid scandal, while others claim he may have collapsed elsewhere in Paris before being brought back to the apartment. One particularly persistent rumor even suggested that Morrison died in the restroom of a nightclub, a claim that has circulated for decades despite the lack of solid evidence. The absence of clear documentation allowed speculation to grow into legend, turning Morrison's death into a puzzle that continues to fascinate investigators and fans alike. What makes the mystery even more powerful is the way Morrison's personality seemed almost designed to inspire myths, because throughout his life he often blurred the line between performance and reality, quoting poetry, philosophy, and mythology in ways that made it difficult to separate the man from the persona he created on stage. His lyrics frequently explored themes of mortality, transformation, and the unknown, as if he were constantly confronting the darker questions of human existence. Perhaps that is why the mystery surrounding his death feels so fitting to many observers, because it reflects the same sense of uncertainty and intrigue that defined his art. After Morrison was quietly buried in Père Lachaise Cemetery, the site gradually became one of the most visited graves in the world, drawing fans who see him not only as a musician but as a symbol of a cultural era when music, poetry, and rebellion collided in extraordinary ways. Graffiti-covered walls and offerings left by admirers testify to the lasting impact he continues to have on generations who were not even alive during his lifetime. Yet even as a legend grows, historians continue to search for evidence that might one day clarify the events of that night in Paris, hoping that documents, witnesses, or forgotten details might finally reveal the truth behind the story. Until that day arrives, the passing of Jim Morrison remains one of the most haunting mysteries in the history of rock music, a story of fame, creativity, excess, and unanswered questions that refuses to fade away, ensuring that the legend of the poet of rock will continue to echo through time just like the hypnotic melodies and haunting words he left behind even more than 50 years after the sudden death of Jim Morrison. The events surrounding his final hour continue to stir curiosity and debate, creating a powerful sense that the full story may still be hidden somewhere beneath decades of rumors, conflicting accounts, and fading memories. Morrison had always been a man surrounded by contradictions, an intellectual poet who became a rock icon, a charismatic performer who often seemed uncomfortable with fame, and a rebellious spirit who constantly searched for deeper meaning beyond the chaos of celebrity life. During his years with the Doors, Morrison helped create music that pushed boundaries and explored themes rarely heard in mainstream rock, blending blues rhythms, psychedelic influences, and poetic storytelling into unforgettable songs such as Light My Fire and the haunting Riders on the Storm, tracks that captured the restless energy of a generation searching for freedom, identity, and new ways of thinking. Yet behind the powerful stage presence and hypnotic voice was a man struggling with the pressures of fame, a struggle that intensified after the controversial concert in Miami in 1969, when Morrison faced accusations of indecent exposure and endured a highly publicized trial that deeply affected his reputation and personal outlook. By the early 1970s, he had grown increasingly weary of the spotlight and began speaking openly about wanting to step away from music in order to focus on writing poetry, something he had always considered his true artistic passion. This desire for a quieter life ultimately led him to move to Paris with his longtime partner Pamela Courson, hoping the historic city would provide the peace and inspiration he needed to begin a new chapter away from the chaos of the American entertainment industry. Friends who encountered Morrison in Paris often described a man who appeared both reflective and restless, wandering through narrow streets, visiting bookshops, and spending long hours discussing literature and philosophy. Yet there were also signs that the habits that had followed him throughout his career, particularly heavy drinking, had not completely disappeared. Then came the morning of July 3rd, 1971, when Courson reportedly found Morrison lifeless in the bathtub of their apartment, an event that would instantly send shockwaves through the music world and create one of the most enduring mysteries in rock history. The official report listed heart failure as a cause of death, but the absence of an autopsy raised immediate questions among fans and journalists who knew Morrison's lifestyle and suspected that the real explanation might be more complicated. Over the decades that followed, countless theories emerged attempting to explain what really happened during those final hours in Paris, ranging from accidental overdose to secret cover-ups and even the persistent rumor that Morrison might have staged his death to escape the overwhelming pressures of fame. While many of these claims lack solid evidence, they have contributed to the mythic aura surrounding Morrison's legacy, transforming his death into a story that feels almost as mysterious and poetic as the lyrics he once wrote after his quiet burial in Pamela's cemetery. Fans from around the world began traveling to the site to pay tribute, turning the grave into a place of reflection. For those who still feel connected to the spirit of the music he created, the worn stones and graffiti-covered walls around the cemetery stand as reminders of how deeply Morrison's voice and vision continue to resonate with people decades after his passing. Perhaps the reason the mystery refuses to fade is because Morrison himself always seemed to live somewhere between reality and legend, a performer who treated life as a kind of artistic exploration where boundaries between truth, myth, and imagination were deliberately blurred. His death, like his music, remains surrounded by questions that may never be fully answered, leaving behind a haunting sense that the final chapter of Jim Morrison's story is still waiting to be understood, a mystery that continues to echo through history, just like the unforgettable voice that once captivated the world that as the years turned into decades. The mystery surrounding the death of Jim Morrison only grew more haunting, almost as if the unanswered questions had become part of the legend itself. Morrison had always been a figure who blurred the lines between poetry, rebellion, and performance, and during his time with the Doors he transformed from an ambitious young poet into one of the most electrifying frontmen in rock history. Audiences were drawn not only to the music but to Morrison's unpredictable presence on stage, where his deep voice and hypnotic delivery could shift a concert from quiet intensity to explosive chaos within moments. Songs like Light My Fire and the atmospheric masterpiece Riders on the Storm revealed a performer who treated lyrics like poetry and concerts like theatrical experiences, creating a reputation that placed him among the most fascinating artists of the 1960s counterculture movement.